Now, everything old is new again. America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
America must face up to arithmetic and particularly fractions.
Lovely day we're having.
Just a minute, ma'am. This canned corn is 3 for $29. You've only got 2 cans here. Do you want to go back and get the other one?
I only want the 2.
I know, but it's 3 for $29.
Is that so? I know it says on one can, 3 strike 29.
That's right.
What that means?
3 for $29.
Uh-huh. But I don't want
you don't
3.
Need. I see, but that doesn't help me any.
So to buy 3 would be almost a lifetime
I know,
supply.
but if you buy 2, you see, it comes out to 9 2/3 cents a can, and we don't have fractions on the machine here.
Welcome to Everything Old is New Again. If you're a keen listener of the radio, you will know that that's a short skit from the award-winning Bob and Ray, who have now retired, of course, and one has passed away. But we are going to discuss Bob and Ray with an author, David Pollock. I'd like my co-host, the ever-urbane David Cohen, to introduce David.
Yeah, we're really excited, Doug. We have, as you mentioned, Emmy Award winner David Pollock, who's written for The Steve Allen Show, Don Rickles, The Carol Burnett Show, All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, MASH, Cheers, Frasier, I think every sitcom, basically, he's written for. And David recently wrote his first novel, Bob and Ray, Keener Than Most Persons. And welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Dave. A pleasure. It's actually not a novel. It's factual. It's a biography.
That's actually what the first thing I was going to point out, and I'm glad you did. Speaking of your history and your experiences, David, I'd like to spend a few minutes just to talk about what you have done, because you have won an Emmy for Frasier, and you've written for many, many TV shows that we have talked about on this show. We've done a number of shows ourselves on older sitcoms. I'm just wondering, are there any particular episodes that may have any meaning for you that you have written, or something that stands out?
Well, I know that on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, it was fun because it was a hit show and everybody was talking about it. So it was just a very pleasurable experience. The characters were very identifiable, it was easy to hear their voices in your ear, and to write, that show. It was a nice list of shows you read, but all the flops I left off the list. So it's pretty easy to pick out ones that and MASH too. It was always fun. It was a pleasure to work on that show, and those characters too were sort of easy to glom onto and write the scripts. I always wrote with my writing partner Elias Davis, and that too, of course, was a big hit. That always makes it nicer. The nice thing, MASH was filmed not in front of an audience, but Mary Tyler Moore and some of the other shows, Steve Allen, and those shows. It was always great because you would hear the audience laughing at what you wrote.
Right.
The very night they shot the show.
Did the fact that it was a live show versus a tape show in any way impact how you wrote?
Well, none of those shows that we've been talking about so far were actually live. But yes, the format of the show would definitely, if the show was live, I was on the Joey Bishop show, the late night Joey Bishop show, that was live. And you had to make sure that the scenery changes could be made, and the production, the production aspect had to be a little simpler because you couldn't stop. You just had to keep going.
Now, with these sitcoms, did any of the actors have any input, or are the writers kind of segregated into their own world and then just pass the script along?
Yeah, the latter is pretty much exactly what happened. the writers, we're all in our individual offices or meeting. In our case, if since you're using the MASH example, Burt Metcalf was the executive producer when I was on the show, and we would often congregate in his office and just have to come up with story ideas and try to do something original that hadn't been done. It was particularly hard in my years because I was there during the 9th, 10th, and 11th years the show was on the air, so they had done just about everything.
Now, with that, with your style of writing, from what I have seen, certainly you do punchlines, but I think I would argue or present to you that you might be more of a situational type of writer, or is there a difference between writing, situational kind of comedy versus just setup and punchlines?
Well,
if that makes any sense.
No, it's a good question. Each show sort of has its own format. You have to start with a good story, and then you have to serve the characters in that story, and you know all the characteristics of those characters, and you try to figure out like on MASH. Using Alan Alda's Hawkeye character, what's the worst thing that could happen given the kind of character he is? How can you put him in the most pressure? And then if the story is about somebody else, you would do that. But you do have to have once you have that story, you just have to keep it moving. And yes, you do have to have jokes. It's never just punchline. It's never just set up punchline. The best jokes come out of the situation and out of the character and his attitude.
David, is there an episode maybe or one or two that you remember that meant a lot to you, that you were more proud of than others?
I guess a show that we won a Humanitas Award for on MASH, having to do with Hawkeye writing, sent up to the front lines where he's under a lot of pressure. There's an attack going on, and everybody is sort of literally in foxholes. And he starts writing his will, and as he comes to each character, to Father Mulcahy, to BJ, to whoever, we dissolve to the we dissolve visually with his voiceover narration as to what he's willing to them, and it usually related to something in the past, which is then dramatized.
Right.
But each show there were the Steve Allen show. We used to laugh our heads off just at things Steve did, having nothing to do with things that we wrote, just things that he ad-libbed, on the just out of whatever happened to be going on at the moment.
That's great. We're going to be right back in 2 seconds, continuing with David Pollack.
Who can turn the world on with her smile?
Okay, David, we're back. We have a few minutes here just to focus on everything old is new again in the selfish tone. We've done a 10 shows, Dave, on trying to determine what is the best sitcom of all time.
At least 10,
and many of the ones that you worked on were in the mix. I'm going to throw you into the fire and ask if you have any input, or even if you'd want to determine what is the best sitcom of all time. And if not, let us know at least what you think is important as a professional in this field to qualify something as a very good sitcom.
Well, I guess the main thing are likable characters, well-defined characters who are funny. When I think back, when I was a kid, the shows all seemed great. I remember Sergeant Bilko with Phil Silvers, The Honeymooners. I realized that was only a sitcom for one season, but they did Honeymooners sketches for 4 or 5, well, for decades on the Jackie Gleason variety show. As we talked earlier, I liked the Mary Tyler Moore Show. In later years, I liked Sex and the City. More recently, Larry David Show, Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's hard to sort of look at that list and draw any conclusions, I guess.
Hence the reason why we had 10 shows doing that. We made up some arbitrary rules and regulations, and we had a lot of fun with it. And we're having a lot of fun right now talking with David Pollock. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show, with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Have you noticed that lady there in the fifth row in the audience?
Holding the ventriloquist dummy on her lap?
Yeah.
She looks interesting. Ma'am, you a professional entertainer, lady?
No, I'm not. Because of this dummy I'm holding, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I was married to a ventriloquist.
Oh.
But I got custody of the dummy, see, when we separated. My husband took the house and the car and a few things like that.
Right. Why'd you ever agree to a settlement like that? Those conditions are kind of unusual. If you're not the one in the family with ventriloquist, what good is the dummy?
Well, my husband was really quite good at his trade. He convinced me that this was our little boy. Of course, I realize now that this baloney about a mother's love outweighing other considerations can get a person into a fine kettle of fish, I'm telling you.
Welcome back. That's the rather subtle, cerebral humor of Bob and Ray on the radio back in the day. We are here on Everything Old is New Again with author David Pollock, who is the author of a biography of Bob and Ray, Keener Than Most Persons. Welcome back, David. Thank you for being with us. Just basically for those who don't know, if you could tell us who is Bob and Ray and why would you write a book about them?
Well, Bob and Ray, Bob Elliott and Ray Goulding, were two guys who, both from New England, they didn't know each other until way years later, but they both grew up in the 30s when radio was the new entertainment. And they actually met in 1946 as two ex-GIs at a Boston radio station, WHDH. Bob had a morning disc jockey show, and Ray read the newscasts every hour or half hour and would hang around, and the two started kibitzing afterwards. And it sort of caught on, and since nobody told them to stop, they kept doing it. And it became so popular that when the station got the rights to the Boston Braves and Boston Red Sox baseball games, they put Bob and Ray on for a half-hour pregame show just to build up the audience. It was called Baseball Matinee, and then when the season ended, the show was so popular they just kept it, and it became Matinee with Bob and Ray. The only thing they really knew to do was to mock popular radio shows of the day. So that was sort of the spine of the comedy. And they ended up, after about 5 years on Boston, on NBC with various network radio and TV series. At one time or another, really, they had shows and guest appearances on all the major networks. They had a Broadway show which ran for about 6 months, and then they toured for another year, had Carnegie Hall concerts, were in a few movies, and in the 1950s, for one period, they were on the air with different shows for about 17 hours a week. As a team, they were together longer than Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Barnes and Allen, and Martin and Lewis.
That's terrific. And they're in the Radio Hall of Fame, of course. And what I find interesting is that they're generational in that I think that if my research is correct, you listened to them and enjoyed them in the 50s in California. I myself certainly, and David enjoyed them in the 70s while in New York. And this is something that the comedy, I think, spans the generations. I'm a huge fan, and I think you are as well. Why do you think that they appeal through all the different ages?
Well, their satires sort of existed in their own special little universe. It was broadcasting about broadcasting. It was Bob and Ray's medium and their subject matter, but the audience's familiarity with what was being lampooned was really not a prerequisite. The comedy was self-contained. You didn't need to know the history of each bit that was being spoofed. For example, Mary Backstage, Noble Wife, was based on a soap opera that ran for, I think, about 20 years. The original was called Mary Noble Backstage Wife, and that had been off since 1959. Others they did, like Aunt Penny, was an old CBS show called Aunt Jenny. Jack Headstrong was All-American was based on Jack Armstrong.
And then I'm going to interrupt you for a second. I'm going to play one clip and let me see a little bit about.
Lee Malou, ace correspondent, speaking from the main office of the Wide Awake Vitamin Company, and the plant superintendent is here beside me. And I think you told me, sir, that your name is Omar. Is it C or? I said your name is Omar C or G. Hungerford, and you're the plant superintendent here at the Wide Awake Company.
That's right. My name is Omar C. Hungerford. I'm the...
Mr. Hungerford, where are you going?
I got a couch in the other office. I'm just going to have to lie down for a little while. I'm beat.
Returning it now to Bob and Ray in New York.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I wanted to. It was perfect along the lines of you introducing all the different parodies that they did. I think one of the most familiar ones may have been Wally Ballou, which was a parody of the reporter on the scene. Correct?
Yeah. All about broadcasting. More specifically to your question, though, about appealing to audiences over the ages. New young audiences kept discovering Bob and Ray just through sheer generational turnover.
So it was just a matter of they were on the radio and the next generation was tuning in on the way to school or wherever it might be, and that's pretty much what happened to me.
Yeah. No knowledge of the history of the show being spoofed was required.
Right. It was funny part. It was when I was listening to it with my friends. We would walk down to the ball field. It would take a 20-minute walk. We'd bring our transistor with us, and we would sometimes walk slower to the field because we wanted to hear the end of this particular bit or whatever it might be. And we didn't even know sometimes the references, as you were mentioning before, because we were so young. But just the subtle comedy there, you could hear Wally Ballou's trouble that he has there, or whatever the situation they may have presented. Did they write their own material? Did they have participants in helping them with that, or what would happen with
They started out in Boston. There was no writing budgets at all, so they just ad-libbed everything. They just, off the top of their heads, they just assumed they did all the voices of the characters. Ultimately, and they kept doing that through their whole career. The Mary Backstage thing I referred to, or Aunt Penny, were always ad-libbed. But when they got to New York and on the network days, on the network shows, they did have to have some writing help. So they did have through the years, various writers at different times. And I go into all of that in the book, and in listening to the routines, you can usually tell what's written and what's spontaneous.
And just for the person that, let's say, in this particular generation that hasn't heard them, people such as Johnny Carson, David Letterman, the original Saturday Night Live cast, Al Franken, a writer from Saturday Night Live and performer, all of these people, in one form or another, enjoyed Bob and Ray so much that they would would participate with them on their shows or gave them credit for their personality and their presentation.
Yeah.
Did the team affect you in any way in your writing style?
Well, I think their sense of humor certainly did. But when you're on a show, the style is pretty much dictated by the performers you're writing for. You have to capture, whether it's Carol Burnett or Steve Allen or Alan Alda, you pretty much have to capture their voices. But certainly, the Bob and Ray sensibility is always in the back of my mind, whether I'm at work writing something or just talking to people at a party or something.
And do you think that they are too cerebral, or do you think that they still would translate to people today?
Well, people today, purchase their old shows and recordings, and they can buy them online, and they continue to do so. So there, as I mentioned before, that generational turnover keeps working, and new listeners keep coming along. It's not like it was in the 50s during their big heyday where they had all these network shows both on TV and radio. But there is they are remembered fondly, as you point out.
Yes, and I would also suggest that they are a team that once you do give them a shot, once you do listen to them, and you can get them on, the internet now. Amazon selling a lot of their recordings, and certainly you get a feel through this of their style and their interest in Bob and Ray, keener than most persons. The book that you've written, David Pollock, and I would suggest that it really is something that if you've bitten by them, you're going to enjoy them for the rest of your life. And we'll be right back.
The Carol Burnett Show with Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence.
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything old is new again, with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Flaming Bombadine.
I can't be shot out of a cannon on a radio program. I said it'd be impossible. The studio isn't big enough. So what we've gone ahead and done is to take a trash can and remove the bottom, and I'll come shooting out of this trash can. I think, though, for safety's sake here, that if you would open that door and at the far end of the studio, so that in case I have too much of a charge in my shoes, I'll go through the door and then out into the hall and...
all
right.
Lots of luck, Flaming Bombadine.
I'm awfully sorry.
Webley Webster just came in, ladies and gentlemen.
When I closed the door, I didn't know that the fellow was going to be shot out of a cannon.
He was right on his way.
Welcome back to Everything Old is New Again. We're here with David Pollock, the author of Bob and Ray, Keener Than Most Persons, a book that is can be found, of course, on Amazon.com, published by Applause Books, and you can look for it on applausebooks.com as well. It's a terrific read. It's a lot of fun about two comedians that I think are underrated to some, and anyone that has heard their comedy, they are unforgettable. And I would suggest that David wrote a terrific book that captures their history and also their place in radio. I would like to suggest that that David, I guess, that you did interview Bob Elliott personally for this book. Is that correct?
Yes, many times over several years.
And as a fan, I have to ask then, the standard question. Of course, Ray Goulding has passed away, but to have Bob in your presence for so many years, especially being a fan of his in the 50s and thereafter, what was that like, and what was he like?
Well, he is one of the most down-to-earth guys you will ever talk to. Soft-spoken, not a shred of showbiz swagger about him. If you, Douglas or Dave, were sitting in a room talking with him, you would have to reconcile in your mind that this was the same guy who did Wally Ballou or Biff Burns or any of those word car, any of those characters. In fact, they were both very private guys. They were really two introverts trapped in an extrovert's business.
Right. And what was he like when you met him? When you talked to him, do you just think, "Oh yeah, this guy is so funny," or does he come across as something a little different?
No, he was never trying to be funny. If something would occur, he would say it, of course. But basically, it was about me asking questions, and either at his he had an apartment in New York, and he has a home in Maine, and with a tape recorder and trying to get the quotes accurate. And so it was business, it was a job,
right?
And his trying to answer the questions. He was very forthcoming, very open about everything, the team's disappointments as well as all their successes.
Now, our show, Everything Old is New Again, is and I personally, and I think Dave as well, are definitely influenced by Bob and Ray. I'd be clear to say that I've said it before. It's not that we do anything like they do, but the bottom line to me is that they brought fun to the radio, and I'm not trying to put radio down now. But there's a lot of talk radio, and some of it's well done, and so forth. But I don't see a lot of shows that are fun on the radio, and I just wonder if that topic ever came up or anything similar to that in terms of the radio today and what Mr. Elliott would think about or does think about radio today and the state of the art.
Well, I think he's a pretty realistic guy about the radio business today. Inevitably, the entertainment business, whether movies, TV, radio, it's always evolving due to many factors, mostly economic.
Right.
But, even for Bob and Ray themselves, they managed to hold on with network shows clear through the 50s, but then they had to move on to their advertising commercial business. They made, TV guest stars and had sitcom roles on various shows. Bob Newhart, on the Bob Newhart show, Bob played Bob Newhart's father on an episode. They had the Broadway shows, as I mentioned, and so forth. And then long after network radio vanished, FM came into power, and the fun days on local AM radio really began to give way to 24-hour news and all talk formats. So it's who knows what it'll be like. We could go way back and movies sort of replaced vaudeville, and then TV battled with movies. It's always changing.
And I do think that there's, just my opinion, that there is room for a continuation of the fun on the radio that Bob and Ray brought. And certainly, if you tune into a Bob and Ray episode or that's on the internet or something you purchase from Amazon.com, it's something that is timeless. And I wonder, did they think in their day that they were doing something that was going to last, or was just something to pay the bill to the end of the week, so to speak?
Well, certainly it was a job, and it was paying some bills.
Right.
But I think they were proud of what they did. They never changed. As you guys pointed out, the years went by and they were the same, but the audiences changed. They knew what they could do, and they sort of stuck to it. But I think, FM radio is sort of flourishing now, and I think there are funny guys in the morning all around the country. I'm not familiar with all the names. You two probably have a better handle on that, but it for the moment, that sort of is the legacy of 50s AM radio in New York with Bob and Ray, and there was another team who comes up in the book, Clavin and Finch, who were on for years.
You know, that's another subject I wanted to ask about, David. It's sort of a lost art, I think, is the concept of the comedy team. You know, you just don't see it too often anymore, and I'm wondering, did that come up in your conversations with Bob, or what do you feel about it?
No, it really didn't, because each of them, independent of each other, neither ever saw themselves as a comedian. They just wanted to be announcers, and that was sort of their.
Interesting.
You know, it was. It just sort of happened. You know, they were thrown together, and they sort of became a team, but they never really considered themselves an act in a sort of comics mindset.
Like, think about that. Ray Goulding was the news person. And now if you think about it, just as a listener, you know, we categorize people, right? And you think the news person is the serious person who is just going to read and talk about the news.
Yeah.
And
well, you know, he really wasn't the newsman. I think he saw himself as an announcer, but that was just one of his assignments.
Right.
I mean, they were also reading fish reports, you know, on the station in Boston. You know, how much ships arriving at the pier. You know, what the price was each day. They had to MC other programs. They did things independent of each other. Bob did an afternoon show, just playing records. They were just two staff guys who just got thrown together because they started ad-libbing in the morning, and one reading the news and hanging around during the other's record show.
Right, and I don't think that they thought of themselves as comedians. We'll be right back.
Next, Mary Backstage, Noble Wife, the story of America's favorite family of the Footlights.
We're still back here with David Pollock and rolling around some ideas about Bob and Ray Keener than most persons, which is the the biography that he has written that is on Amazon.com and Applause Books. .com. It's a terrific read. What I was trying to say right before that little break there is that I think that some of the beauty and as a listener is they weren't pushing it and trying to have a punchline every other word. They kind of was so relaxed in what they were doing that they allowed, and maybe it was the time frame, I don't know, they were given the opportunity, or however it worked out, they did bits that took their time to develop, and that was fine with them. They didn't have to have a laugh every 2 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. You hit a key point there. When they came along, when they got to the network in 1951, the dying days of the big comedy shows, up to that point, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Edgar Bergen, and Charlie McCarthy, all those comedians, they had great shows, big jokes, big laughs, all huge successes. They sort of played to the balconies. They had big casts and orchestras and a large studio audience. Bob and Ray sort of tampered with the status quo by the network radio's convention of the day. The two were really game changers. They had as you point out, more of an intimate style with no studio audience present. It was up to the listener to determine what was funny. It was just two guys, and this is really the basic, synthesized to its essence. The essence of what Bob and Ray are just two guys in a studio entertaining themselves and each other, but the audience was in on it as kind of accomplices or co-conspirators.
Exactly.
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything old is new again, with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Next, Mary Backstage, Noble Wife, the story of America's favorite family of the Footlights and their fight for security and happiness against the concrete heights of Broadway.
We are back with David Pollock, author of Bob and Ray, Keener Than Most Persons. And this is a terrific biography by and published by Applause Books. You can find it at applausebooks.com, amazon.com. It's a terrific read and so much fun to experience the inside workings of one of America's greatest radio comedy teams of all time. And we were continuing a discussion off the air. I'd like to continue, if we can, on the air, a little bit about how the audience played a part in the mindset of Bob and Ray and their presentation of their, I guess you'd call them skits or bits on the radio.
Yeah, well, as I was saying, they were just, unlike those other big comedy shows, they were just two guys in a studio entertaining themselves and each other, but the audience was in on it as kind of a third member of a two-man team. The audience, they were accomplices or co-conspirators, if you will. Unlike many comedians with larger-than-life personas, the team more or less, they distinguished themselves by sort of appearing normal with a complete absence of showbiz slickness. There was, when you think about it, there was no definable on-air character of Bob Elliott or Ray Goulding, or Ray Goulding. They were just content to let their multiple characters carry the comedy load because they believed in their characters and the absurd premises. Their audiences did too.
And the audience
they had a very infectious on-air camaraderie. The lure was the relationship and the interaction. You sort of wanted to learn their secret handshake.
Right, and you were sort of the third person, and you had some ownership as an audience member. I remember, this is going to be very obscure, but there was a spaghetti commercial back in the day in the 70s, and this kid would run around, the mother would be yelling for him, Anthony, and they put that into skits, and I remember doing that as a catchphrase as a kid running
Anthony.
around. Yeah, right. Or there was this person that would show up every so often. They would turn, and especially Mary backstage, and that's the worst person in the world. This person's eating something. Yeah. And my brother to this day and we're umpteen years old, still once in a while or on a plane or whatever it might be, we'll say, there's the worst person in the world. These things, we became part of the bit, and that's, I think we sort of felt that we were part of the team, and that was the allure of it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was doing 20 years before that in the 50s. In those years, they had a series of great sound effects guys on their Mutual and CBS shows who would just stick things in, just non sequitur things. When they got to WOR, AM radio was sort of changing, and that series was a little bit done on the cheap. They weren't even given a sound man. They couldn't even play the same themes for all their soap, like Mary Noble. They no longer could play the Les Baxter Celestial Nocturne theme that they had always used as the opening and closing. But the spirit of it was still the same.
And let's listen to the spirit of that Mary Backstage, who's mentioned a couple times. A little short clip here.
Still haven't been able to figure that out yet.
Well, it's whether you want the butter on here. I'll show you. You see, this would be the near side.
Which side?
This one.
Well, why is that any different than the other side?
It's nearer to me. Then on the other side would be the far side. Now, if you butter on the far side, it would be different than buttering on the near side.
But holding it that way, you'd be buttering your fingers, wouldn't you, if you buttered on the far side?
I would be buttering my fingers, but I just butter the toast.
Let me see you butter the far side of that piece of toast.
Just like that. There's no problem.
Well, now look at your hand. See, your left hand covered with butter.
Oh, it's the toast.
I don't think that's the way to do it at all.
300 slices coming up.
Right. And butter them on the near side.
I mean, just so natural, the presentation, two silly voices or one silly voice there, different people going through their house of toast, and to describe that to the audience is...
And because it was on every day, the listeners knew every character, and it was sort of a little out of context there to know what the stakes were at the moment, but it's a great example of the spontaneous ad-libbing, which is, I guess, is a little redundant.
Right.
Good ad-libbing has to be spontaneous. But yeah, of the crosstalk and of keeping, 4 and 5 different characters alive in their imagination, and to know what each is thinking about at every given moment. It was a real talent.
And it's my understanding from the book, Bob and Ray, keener than most persons, and we're talking with David Pollock, that when they performed all of the things that they did, but let's just talk about Mary Backstage, because you say, of course, they had 4 main characters and then other characters thereafter that were introduced into the mix, that they would do that, I think it's about a 3 or 4 or 5 minute skit, but they would do that without stopping, right? They would just take the thing through.
They were on live. If you were, it depends upon what series you're talking about. But when they were on, they didn't do Mary Backstage on CBS or Mutual, but they had another soap opera, The Life and Loves of Linda Lovely, in those days, and it was exactly the same. It was the same voices, the same characters, but different names. And totally spontaneous.
Yeah, and you could hear them once in a while laugh, but for the most part, they were, straightforward, deadpan about it, and that was funny about it.
Deadpan,
so you turn to your friend, you say, "Wait a minute, are we supposed to laugh at that? That is hysterical,"
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you feel that?
Well, excuse me for interrupting, but that was the point I was sort of making earlier. It was up to the listener to determine. You had to pay attention.
Right.
It was up to the listener to determine what was funny. There was no studio audience sending you that signal.
Right. And again, as we say, that then made the audience members part of this, and it's infectious. You just become part of all of these skits and unrealistically become an owner of their comedy. And that's why it's so personal. You love it. Their comedy was so clean too. Of course, it had to be clean on the radio, but that's another point that, anyone can listen to any of their skits. And of course, they were on Broadway and Carnegie Hall. They crossed all the generations, and when they were on Broadway and Carnegie Hall, I guess it was the late 70s, was it?
Actually, the play opened in September of 1970 and ran into 71.
Okay. Were they the toast of the town? Where did they stand on the Broadway stage with regard to the general public?
It ran about 6 months. It was a hard ticket to get. And it got unbelievable reviews, particularly from the New York Times, which is the big one.
Right.
And then they took it on the road. But it was a produced evening in the theater. It wasn't just doing radio bits. They were moving about, changing costumes, and it was it was quite an impressive show.
Yeah, something I just lost in the time there. That's something that you can get you can get tapes of that or recordings of that, audio recordings. I would love to have seen that. That's just me as an aside.
Yeah, I don't know that there was a TV HBO abbreviated or edited version which they redid for TV. But I don't know that there's actual, unless you know something I don't. I don't know that there's actual video of the Broadway show.
No, there isn't, and that's why I say it's what a shame. It's just a terrific fun to be spending our day with the author of Bob and Ray, Keener Than Most Persons, David Pollock. This is a book that is a must-read behind the scenes, and I bet you once you read this book, you're going to take a look and enjoy listening to some Bob and Ray bits. We'll be back. Everything old is new again. So, David, we have 1 more minute left. I'm going to just throw the microphone, if you will, over to you and see. And if not, we could fill in for you here. But what would be some, if you can remember, any of your favorite bits or something that you'd like to tell us before we say goodbye?
Bob and Ray bit you were talking about?
Yes.
Well, some of the funny premises I remember are a Wally Ballou at a bomb factory that manufactures bombs that within the price range of the average consumer.
And I remember the sandwich of the day. Used to love that one. Wish we had some more time with David Pollack on Everything Old is New Again. Thank you very much for being with us. We'll be back.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.